First of all, I just want to say really warm welcome because this is our first online session of the year. And we've all been very busy doing various things for commemorating this centenary year of Ilyenkov's birth, which was only a couple of weeks ago, 100 years ago. So we're really, really pleased that Alex Levant can join us and can start off a discussion on his and Kyoko and Miriam McSweeney's new book. Kyoko is with us. I don't think Miriam has joined us yet, but they are co-authors of a new book called Activity Theory, an Introduction. And you've hopefully read Alex's essay that's in that book. But I just want to say, Alex and I actually met, believe it or not, 10 years ago in Helsinki at a wonderful conference organized by Vesa Oitinen, where also one or two people here were present, including Heli Katraskowski, which was a very fantastic conference. But it was actually that same year that Alex wrote he translated the essay by Ilyenkov, which is in this book, which George has just said quite rightly is a wonderful piece of translation, especially for those of us who've struggled with earlier translations that have not been so good. And Alex also has contributed an essay to this book, which is about Walter Benjamin and the ideal. And he is presently assistant professor of communication studies at Wilfred Laurier University. But his real contribution to humanity is the way he's able to place Ilyenkov into the present, just to put it that way, to explain and enlighten and develop the ideas that Ilyenkov developed in the realm of philosophy as well as psychology and human society as a whole, in the aspiration to change the world and make it a place fit for human beings and animals and the planet to survive in. I think that's about all I want to say. But just to say, we'll take Alex's introduction, and then after that we'll have hopefully plenty of time for discussion. And if you want to speak, you can put your hand up digitally, or you can put your name into the chat box. And then Carol and I will call on you in that order. And hopefully we can have a little bit of time to sum up at the end. But I mean, we normally have these sessions no more than 1.5 hours maximum. So I think with that in mind, or maybe even a little bit less, see how it goes. If that's okay with you, Alex, that format, yeah?
Excellent.
Oh, okay, so unless there's any urgent questions, we can start.
Thank you so much, Karina. Thank you so much. It's so nice to see you again and to see everyone. And I thought about that too. It's true. It's been 10 years, and I remember meeting you. And it's amazing to see what you've managed to accomplish. I remember when I first met you, I could tell you had organizational skill and activist energy. Yes, I'm not surprised that you're able to pull this together. This is amazing. So I'm very happy to be here and just to be in the space with you and everyone else. So thank you for inviting me. And I'm also happy to see that Kyoko's here, and I do hope that Miriam will join us at some point, because it would be nice to get their perspectives as well. As you'll see in a moment, we come at this from slightly somewhat different fields and different perspectives, and it really shows some of the breadth and the richness of this project, I think, and the field overall. So is it possible for me to share my screen? I just have some slides I wanted to.
Yes, it shouldn't be a problem. We can just do it, Alex. Should be.
Yeah, I just have to find my 1 second, sorry. Screen sharing has failed to start. Why? It's not letting me do it. Oh, there we go. Okay, are you able to see that okay?
Yep.
Yeah. No, I can't see you guys. I only see a couple of you. Oh, that's okay. This is much more interesting than seeing me and the fake mountains behind me. Put this away a little bit. Okay. So, another good reason that Karina brought up our meeting 10 years ago was a conference on Ilyenkov where we met. And I'd been doing quite a bit of work on Ilyenkov at that point. And I hadn't come across activity theory only insofar as it figured within the Soviet Union, but not so much in the West. And I remember how surprised I was, quite frankly, when I first realized that there was this entire body of thought that had developed in the West in so many different directions, in so many different disciplines. And I became just quite fascinated by that. And I started to try to figure out what happened. Tried to trace some of the lineages. How did these ideas spread? How did they end up at these particular places? How did they change? And how did they become applied in so many different fields and in so many different ways that would be really unpredictable and quite unrecognizable, I think, to someone like Ilyenkov. And maybe to many of you as well. It certainly was for myself, coming out of the focus on Ilyenkov and philosophy, Soviet philosophy. Activity theory in the West, at first glance, appears to be just something else altogether. But once you start to trace the common root, you begin to realize these, the interesting similarities, and then it becomes fascinating to see why these changes happen. And what does all this mean? That what does this tell us, I suppose, about the kernel of this tradition? And so I really embarked on a mission trying to educate myself and trying to meet and find all of at least some of the principal figures in this field who'd been doing work in activity theory outside of the Soviet Union. And that's really how I met Karina. I was in Helsinki for that conference, and also for the center, the Cradle Center, where I met Angstrom and the people working there. And that was also very interesting for me. And basically, I tried to chart how this happened, and focus on some of the most interesting applications today. And to try to pull back the lens and to see where is this going as a field? Is there somewhere this could be going as a field? Is there something more here than just simply a collection of different disparate theorists working separately from each other that have nothing in common but a common root, perhaps? And so what this book does is a reflection on that. It's an exposition, I guess, of some of the interesting contemporary applications. Oops, let me just yeah, I'll just move on to the next slide. You can see here a little bit on the back. Really, the idea behind this is to try to introduce this field to those who are not familiar with activity theory. What I found, the more that I researched this, the more I began to realize how rich this is and how much potential there is here as a research methodology to answer everything from the biggest questions to the very, very small kind of concrete applications. And I guess this is a contribution to that effort, to trying to look at this overall and to see what kind of self-reflections can we have on this field, what kind of contribution can we make to making this perhaps a bit more coherent, a bit more to shine a bit more light on this. So it ultimately, I can see this being a research methodology that has much broader reach, that could be adopted, reflected on, critiqued, etc., at the highest levels. Right? And so this this volume here, I'm going to speak in terms of my my chapter here in a moment, but I just want to give you a very quick overview. This is the table of contents. So I sent you my chapter, right? And so you should have access to that. And I'll just pull, what I'll do here is just to pull a few parts of it and just make a few comments and then see what folks think. Have a broader conversation. But I also want to tell you how the book is organized here. It's in 3 parts. So the middle part 2, okay, it consists of the applications. These are contemporary interventions in 3 different fields, although there are many other fields as well, but it particularly focuses on social movement theory, post-human studies, and education. But parts 1 and 2, they are more, well, part 1 is an introduction for folks who are not familiar with this altogether, to situate the history of activity theory, to situate what this is altogether, and also some of the some of the differences in perspectives. And part 3 tries to take a step back and look at where this is coming from and where this might possibly be going. Right? And there are also a couple of interesting interviews here. One with David Backhurst in part 1 that reflects on his time in Moscow in 1980. And another one that I really enjoyed doing, but part 3, the one with Michael Cole, where he filled in a lot of gaps for me in terms of his him meeting Luria in the early 60s, him traveling to Moscow in 1962. He was one of really the first links between the West and Vygotsky's work. And so I found that interview is quite interesting as well. So, but this is just a very quick overview of this. And also, of course, there's a chapter by Miriam McSweeney and Kyoko Murakami, who are my co-editors for this book. The 3 of us put this together. Without them, this really wouldn't have been possible. So they have a chapter in this as well. All right, and this I think to some extent this collection shows some of the breadth here. And it's really a beginning. There's so much more to this. But what I found is that the more I looked into it, the more I realized that there are research centers around the world that specialize. There's of course the 2 main ones, one in Helsinki, where we met, and one in California, University of San Diego. But there are many others as well, right? And so and things have also changed considerably since I started doing my research. I think activity theory has become much bigger now than it was, and I think that's going to continue. But nevertheless, it has its limits and its problems, and I try to identify some of those as well, and some of the critiques. I'm not the first person to try to reflect on activity theory as a whole, and so I try to bring those in as well to look at some of the existing critiques and how perhaps they can be overcome. Well, I just wanted to share with you, this is a little bit from, we each of the editors have a forward here, a very, very brief forward. And I started mine off with with what I really find is to be the common root of all of this. If there's one thing that brings together activity theory in the West, activity theory or the activity approach in the Soviet Union, and the work of Ilyenkov, Vygotsky, etc., is really Marx, and in particular the first thesis on Feuerbach, and that's why I started off with this. Worthwhile reflecting on it. The chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that the thing, reality, sensuousness, is conceived only in the form of the object of contemplation, but not a sensuous human activity, practice. And that seems to be, that made a big impact on Ilyenkov, and I can understand how that is and that insight that we find in that first thesis resonates strongly throughout this entire body of work. Okay? And so I started as I said, I came to this. And we all come to this in different ways. Most scholars I met in the activity theory world know Ilyenkov through that. Whereas for myself, it's a little bit backwards. I came to activity theory through Ilyenkov, and I was working in particular on his concept of the ideal, as Karina mentioned, and that translation that really grabbed me. I went to Moscow in 1898. A long time ago, as a graduate student. I spent almost a year there doing research, and that is when I first came across Ilyenkov, and it was David Backhurst who was, I don't know how it happened, but quite by chance ended up with a copy of his book on Ilyenkov, Consciousness and Revolution. And that was my introduction to it. And I had read it, and when I was in Moscow, I tracked down that 1962 entry on the ideal that Ilyenkov wrote. And that was the first thing I'd read by him directly. But it wasn't really until 2009 that the full article, The Dialectics of the Ideal, was published in Russian by Maidansky, and in the journal Logos. And that became a focal point for a few years, trying to translate that into English. Right? And that's what came out in that book, Dialectics of the Ideal. So that was my entry point into Ilyenkov. That has really been my focal point on Ilyenkov, is that concept specifically. And that was my bridge into this body of thought on activity theory. And so I try to articulate this here. See, this book is not meant for philosophers. It's meant as a general book for researchers. And so I'm trying to explain this in a way that is hopefully accessible. Try to situate this concept of the ideal within concepts that might be more familiar. Right? How do we understand things? Are they simply immutable truths, or are they just social conventions? Right? And trying to show how Ilyenkov's concept of the ideal charts another understanding, another path, another way of understanding ideal phenomena, not as simply conventions, and clearly not as immutable truths, but as products of human activity. Right? And this is what I find so intriguing in this body of work in activity theory, because in a lot of ways, if we think about it, that's really what they're doing. The theorists within this body of thought, including some of you who are here right now, whom I've learned from quite a bit over these years, are doing exactly that, are charting this world of activity, are trying to map it, are trying to understand it, are have had it illuminated, that its presence illuminated by these ideas, and are now going about trying to understand it, trying to figure it out. Right? And so from Ilyenkov, in a lot of ways, for me, the path to activity theory is fairly straightforward. It's not really that I mean, in a lot of ways, it seems there are significant gaps, and maybe if Ilyenkov were here, I have no idea what his reaction would be. But we're skipping a lot of fields and a lot of perspectives, and really an entire philosophical underpinning. Largely, the Marxist groundwork is, by and large, not present, and not entirely, but in many of these theories are no longer present. But but nevertheless, I think that the applications, the breadth of applications of these ideas, ultimately, what I became convinced of is that it showed me the ultimate power of these ideas in the sense that they can resonate with real world problems, and whether we apply them to problems of social organization in terms of building social movements and more powerful revolutionary organizations and things like that, or if we apply them on in terms of making our organizations run smoother, better, whatever that organization might be aiming to achieve. The efficacy shows that there's something there, right? And I guess ultimately I started to think that even though that these ideas are being applied so broadly and so effectively, that I would ultimately like to see them applied more broadly and to bigger issues, I guess. In terms of both politics and philosophy, I suppose, right? So that is in some ways, I guess, my objective here. I'm in terms of where I see the potential of all of this. So this was this is Karina already showed this. This is just a cover of Dialectics of the Ideal. That's that earlier work on the ideal. And I mean, this is really what drew me to Ilyenkov. There's a lot that drew me to Ilyenkov, and I can talk about that more later. But I'm really not sure. It depends where people are interested in exploring further. But what I found particularly interesting in Ilyenkov is this notion that there's this special reality. These are his words, with this peculiar objectivity, and this is where I draw the title from. That there's something that exists that he claims we can't immediately see, and he's trying to draw our attention to. And that this something isn't just ephemeral, but it's material. It's subjective, but it has a peculiar objectivity in the sense that it's different from regular objects. And the difference being, as we saw from the thesis on Feuerbach, is that it refers to activity as opposed to objects. And activity is a bit more difficult to spot. You can see objects. Take a look at a picture, a photograph, you see objects, but activity is hard to see. For that, it's much easier to see if you've got a motion picture, a film. But when you have a still, it's much more difficult to see. Okay? And so with Ilyenkov, you have this idea that there's this world that he's trying to illuminate, and also what does this world consist of, right? And so there's a couple of quotes here that I put on, and this is from Dialectics of the Ideal, where he's trying to tell us that this is not a separate world from us. It's not like some sort of a world that he's discovered that no one else can see, but that it's part of the same world that we all inhabit. It's just not immediately apparent. And so what is this world? Where he describes it here. These are the cultural norms, as well as the grammatical, syntactical, linguistic norms in which he, the individual, the person who's just waking up, I guess, learned to speak, as well as the laws of the state in which he was born, as well as the rules of thinking about the things around him since the world of his childhood, and so on and so forth. He must internalize all of these normative patterns. See, these are normative patterns. Is a special reality that is distinct, clearly distinct from himself and from his brain. So he's locating this not in the human brain and not as in some sort of an other world, but in patterns of activity that we all find ourselves within, and he claims we internalize, and in the course of internalizing them, we awaken to consciousness, right? So there's this other move being made here, that it's pre-exists us in the course of appropriating these patterns of activity. We awaken to consciousness and become conscious beings. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And I mean, I spent years and years looking at that, and I still find it incredibly interesting. Right? Trying to explain those ideas in a way that is interesting, accessible, and meaningful, I suppose, to those who are not philosophers and those who don't have those kind of questions about the truth value of knowledge, etc. It's not that straightforward. One approach I've taken is to use this metaphor of moving from a still image to a moving image. And here I have this as by way of illustration. I'm a little bit sad that we weren't able to include this in the book because it's copyrighted, and it would have cost, and so we decided not to include it. But everyone, I imagine you're probably all familiar with this image. It's an iconic image from the 20th century. It's been reproduced many, many times. It's been recreated in statues all over the world, and typically signifies largely what you probably imagine, right? A romantic kiss. It's taken at the end of World War II on Victory Day. And still to this day in 2024, I find this image sold in poster sales at the university where I work. There's an annual poster sale where students buy posters to put up on their university rooms, and this is still being sold there. But the story of this image, for those of you who had time to read the chapter, or maybe those of you who are aware of it, it's not common knowledge, quite frankly, still, that these people didn't know each other. This is not a romantic kiss at all. In reality, what happened here is this woman was a nurse who was on lunch break. She had no idea who this guy was. He was celebrating here with his friends and his fiancée, who was walking just a couple of feet behind him. He grabbed her out of the blue and, put a lock on her, and then let her go and continued on. And that was the last time she saw him. She had no idea who he was. He had no idea who she was. They met again in 1980 when Life magazine did many decades later, and nobody knew who they were. There was a lot of controversy, not controversy, what's the word? Speculation about who these people were. Lots of fake people coming forward claiming to be them. But eventually Life magazine managed to track them down for a story in 1980, and they met each other again 35 years later, I guess. And so their real story came forward, and this came out a few times. And there was another article that came out in 2005 where this woman Greta was more explicit in what actually happened. And it's quite interesting that despite her testimony, this image still continues to be signified in exactly the same way as before, right? Now, when we look at this image, it's difficult to know what's going on here. Most of us look at it and it looks like the way, we typically imagine it, as a romantic kiss. Why would we think any different? You look at the people in the background, they all happen to be smiling. It's, when you know the context a little bit more, you might pick up on her body a bit more. Look at her fist, like her left arm. Look at her face. It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell. Still hard to tell. Right? You really need to be able to roll back. If you did have, instead of a picture, if you had some footage of, say, a few minutes, you could roll it back, then you'd have a better sense of what happened there. And if you could fast forward, you'd know that they had no idea. They didn't know each other, and you'd have a better sense of what happened. But in the absence of that, it's really impossible to tell. And I guess the idea here, the metaphor here, as you can probably imagine, is that context is metaphorically representative of this ideal world that Ilyenkov is talking about, those patterns of activity that we don't have access to. When we think in freeze frame, right? When we think of the world as a set of discrete objects, rather than think of the world dialectically as being interconnected and in process, right? Which we typically do, right? Meaning that we think of the world in freeze frame. But as a part of an effort to avoid heavy philosophical jargon and try to understand this in a different way, I've been trying to think of it in terms of film versus picture. and what that reveals, so that when you are able to recontextualize the still image within a moving narrative, the meaning of those figures becomes clear in a way that it couldn't possibly. Maybe if you had a series of still images, you could try to, if you had enough of them, you could perhaps sort of piece together the narrative that's unfolding there. It's hard to tell. But the idea is that there is some kind of a narrative. And if you're thinking of things only in still images, you're not really thinking about the narrative. You're just thinking of the meaning of things in relation to each other, but not in relation to an unfolding narrative. And well, it's hard to tell what's going on, I guess, if you look at things that way. Things appear to just kind of happen on their own. Right? Things appear to be mystically present. This is why I popular culture reference. I grew up on the original series of Star Trek. I don't know how many of you remember this episode. I made reference to it in the article here, where the Captain Kirk and the crew, they go to this planet, and things are happening in a mystical way. Objects are being moved around. They don't really understand what's happening. They hear this buzzing, and they don't really know what's going on. And eventually they figure out that there are other people there, other beings that are moving at an accelerated rate. They're moving so quickly they can't see them. And to them, those people who are moving quickly, our protagonists are moving very, very slowly. And so when they're moving around, the ones who are moving quickly, they can drink an entire cup of coffee, whereas our protagonists have no idea what happened. The coffee just vanished. Right? That something similar is happening here. That unless we pay attention to this narrative unfolding, it appears to be just discrete moments in time with who knows what is causing these things. It could be gods or demons, or we have no idea. Right? But mystical connections can be made and are made. Right? But when you set it within its proper context, within that unfolding narrative, you can start to piece things together. And what you begin to see, according to Ilyenkov, is that it's not gods or demons. It's us. We're doing this. Right? We're actually doing it through our collective activity. It's like when my youngest daughter, a long time ago, I gave her this flashlight that would project the moon onto the wall. And she would follow it around. She'd try to find the moon. She'd go from one room to another, just trying to run around, trying to grab it. Until eventually she realized that she was the one who was creating that moon that was coming from her flashlight, right? That's basically something along those lines. And it's a realization that we're the ones who are doing this through our own activity. We're creating the moon, right? But how we're doing it, and then, how does this happen? Why? And then it becomes, those kind of questions that open up. But largely that it's us who are doing it and not something else or someone else, right? And then you can understand it when you think in film, right? It's these patterns, these activity patterns are invisible in freeze frame, but they appear when things are in motion. So this is one way of thinking about it, that it's a special, why is it a special reality? What is peculiar about this objectivity? Well, it's special because it's invisible when in freeze frame. When we think in freeze frame, it vanishes. It only appears when we're thinking in film, when we think in process, that things are unfolding, they're moving. There's some kind of a there are patterns that are unfolding through time. That we're thinking not just synchronically, but diachronically, another set of terms that are used to describe something similar. And that it's peculiar, this objectivity, because unlike regular objects that you can touch, desks and chairs, human activity, you can also touch it, but it only exists when you take a unit of analysis that includes some kind of duration. Otherwise, there is no motion. Things are frozen. So it's difficult to see. All right, so that's where the peculiarity of this objectivity comes from. So it's a special reality with a peculiar objectivity, but it's just as real as everything else, and it's part of the same reality. And it's really its only peculiarity. It has to do with us, with our frame of thinking, not with itself. That's what's making it peculiar. And I guess what he's trying to do is to get us to think about it differently, to bring it into view. And that's how I've been trying to think about activity theory, the field as a whole, that it examines this world of activity. It looks at this aspect of material reality in all sorts of different ways. It's not singular. And that which typically goes unnoticed, but that's but that's really what it's focusing on. Yeah, this is just another quote from the Ideal. Maybe it's worthwhile. This is where Ilyenkov is describing this special reality, this ideal world, that it confronts the individual. That it's not something we can just simply deconstruct. You can't think it out of existence. That it confronts the individual as the thought of preceding generations, realized, reified, objectified, alienated, in sensuously perceptible matter, in language, and in visually perceptible images, in books and statues, in wood and bronze, in the form of places of worship and instruments of labor, in the designs of machines and state buildings, in the patterns of scientific and moral systems, and so on. That this is where they exist. And that within these material, I guess, moments of the ideal, that these material moments of the ideal act like blueprints for subsequent activity. Think of it that way. So this is what I'm trying to capture with this idea of thinking in film. So what would that mean? It would be to approach observable phenomena as moments in process rather than individual things. I think that's really what he's trying to get us to think about here, that these are moments in a process. These aren't, and as soon as we start to think about them as individual phenomena, whether they're ideal or material, then we'll lose those connections. Right? So the unit of analysis has to include duration. It has to be focused on process. And then it becomes this loop that otherwise, when we look at them in freeze frame, they become reified as things, as discrete things, which Lukács captured very well, many years earlier, I think, in the History and Class Consciousness. So awakening to consciousness. I mean, so this is another move that he makes here. I mean, so ultimately, this is significant. In addition to everything that's been said already, this is also significant because it is precisely here that in this world of activity, in these patterns, that Ilyenkov locates not only meaning and how things acquire meaning, but how humans acquire minds, essentially, how human beings acquire something that we call a human mind, that in the absence of this, we don't develop in this way, that the human mind doesn't develop from the human brain. It's not a physiological phenomenon, that it's a social phenomenon. It's an very interesting argument that you find that in Vygotsky as well, as I'll come to in a moment, and really throughout this field, right? And it's really through this process of trying to acquire, to appropriate this social consciousness that human beings learn to comport themselves within this world. They start to, I guess essentially the function of consciousness is to help us move around within this social environment, not just the natural one, but within the social one, in as much as in the natural one. And this idea of consciousness forms in slow motion, it's really quite fascinating. I mean, this is something I looked at prior to looking at activity theory. When I was already doing work on Ilyenkov, I already knew about his connection to Meshirakov and the work on the deaf-blind children. But this is just an incredible example, right? And I guess this this way of phrasing it comes from Leontiev, one of Vygotsky's, I guess, collaborators, um, um, who who um, actually no, I'm sorry, sorry, I think it was it Leontiev who used that term? It was either Leontiev or Meshcherakov. I might be mistaken. I can't remember exactly who used the term. Consciousness forms in slow motion. I'm second guessing myself because it doesn't make sense for it to be Leontiev, because it's in reference to the Zagorsk experiments, which were in the 70s, with the deaf-blind children, basically trying to develop a real-world application with remarkable success of these ideas. You know, if the argument is that consciousness develops not as a product of the human brain, not as simply a product of acquiring language or many other things that we have focused on, but precisely as a product of being of appropriating social practices. That in the course of appropriating social practices, one's mind develops. That if that were to be the case, then perhaps it'd be possible to create a program for children who are who typically would have access to that social world, but are blocked from it for various reasons. In this case, because they happen to be deaf and blind, and so through sense of touch, they were incorporated into social practices. First, by making their beds, using utensils, and things like that. And Meshcherakov chronicles that in his book Awakening to Consciousness. And Ilyenkov, participating in those in that work, I guess, found that to be confirmation of these ideas, right? And so that's very interesting in terms of consciousness forming in slow motion. And these are just pull quotes from the chapter, and which you have access to. I don't want to take up too much time in reading this for you. I'm just summarizing this as we're going, right? But this is something that David Backhurst focused on as well in his book. And also, Meshcherakov noticed that his work had consequences, I mean, as incredible as they were in the field of disability studies, that there were broader applications here that had consequences for our understanding of the human mind more broadly. And so this I find really quite interesting, you know, particularly like I'm doing recently now, I'm doing quite a bit of work on artificial intelligence, especially in the last year and a half, since there's been a lot of public focus on that with these new technologies and whatnot. And particularly, you know, going back about a year, last spring or so, those maybe even earlier, and still somewhat to this day, there's a lot of anxiety about these new technologies becoming kind of, you know, self-aware and acquiring their own agendas, and kind of like Terminator coming to kill us and things like that, right? That they might become self-aware and not in tune with what we want and do things to us and things like that. And I think that level of anxiety has to some extent waned. I think people are more and correctly anxious about losing jobs and things like that, rather than AI becoming alive and trying to kill them, stuff like that. But I spent quite a bit of time thinking about what is going on there. You know, why do we have, what does this tell us about how we conceive of minds, right? And what Ilyenkov has helped me with, and what activity theory I find helpful with, is an understanding of the human mind, an understanding of minds not as products of things. So the mind, just like the human mind, doesn't appear as a product of the brain, but rather as a social phenomenon. The notion of a Terminator-style robot becoming self-aware is absolutely nonsensical from this perspective. That would just never happen. It would be kind of similar to taking a human baby, even with a human brain, isolating them from society immediately upon, prior to acquiring language and etc., and expecting them to become self-aware. From this perspective, that wouldn't happen. They need to be actually incorporated into society. They need to go through the process of appropriating these activity patterns, and in the absence of which their minds don't develop. And so that the expectation of a machine to be able to spontaneously become self-aware presupposes a conception of mind where a technological breakthrough could lead to that, some sort of spark. Right? I mean, I don't know if that's true or not, but it's certainly very different from what we're talking about here. From this perspective, that could never happen. And that the human mind didn't appear because the human brain somehow evolved in a particular way and a spark happened, but that it arose because human communities started to develop new activity patterns. And those activity patterns necessitated new subjectivities. And those new subjectivities and activity patterns then necessitated new biological changes and so on. Right? This is in the work of Michael Tomasello that he chronicles some of this. That makes a lot more sense, at least from consistent with this perspective. That's very, very different, right? So this idea of a technological breakthrough of mind is very foreign when it comes to an activity theory perspective of mind. It's difficult to imagine that. You'd have to. I'm not saying that it couldn't happen, but you have to step completely outside of this body of thought. Right? It would really challenge a lot of this. Right? From this perspective, consciousness is not a product of an individual kind of wiring, biological wiring, right? But it's a product of it's a social phenomenon. It's a product of a social experience, basically, right? In the absence of which it wouldn't happen. So, and I think that Vygotsky, like in this tradition, is really, I think, the most famous of all of these folks. He's the most well known. When I talk to people outside of this field, the most luck I have is with Vygotsky. Some would have come across him in psychology or early childhood education. And here, I mean, in a lot of ways, he's the point figure in this body of thought. He precedes Ilyenkov certainly, and is a one, how can I put it? I mean, his ideas were. It's hard to imagine all of this developing in the absence of Vygotsky, certainly. And he articulates this so clearly. I'm sure this is, these are some of the most famous full passages from Vygotsky that you're probably all quite familiar with. But nevertheless, they're just he captures this so well, trying to demonstrate the intersubjectivity of the human mind, showing that the mind doesn't develop simply from the brain, right? That it develops between people through an experience that happens between people. And that example of pointing that he gives when a child is trying to grab an object that is just out of reach, and an adult spots that and brings the object to the child, and that the next time the child reaches for the object and the same thing happens, the child has an awareness builds that there's a consequence to their reaching, that they might not be able to get the thing, but the adult might see it and bring it to them, and eventually they stop reaching for it, but it turns into a gesture for the adult, right? And that experience builds a sign, basically, that they acquire a tool called pointing, that now they know, aha, by doing this, that will happen, right? And that becomes like a building block of their mind, right? And so on and so on and so on. And then, as life continues, we get more and more of those. And that becomes our toolkit to think with. And that essentially the mind is built of those on inter-individual territory, and then is internalized. Right? A pretty radical proposition, right? And it does stand in stark contrast to this notion that the mind comes from the brain, that the brain is just this amazing organ that is just incredible, and it creates the mind. But if that were to be the case, then of course you can imagine, as incredible as it is, and eventually we'll be able to create a mechanical one. Why not? Right? And which will be able to also create a mind. But this is telling us that it's not our brain. Right? It's not our brain. And so expecting a machine to do that, it'll be a long wait. It's not going to happen. Right? So this is pointing us in a very different direction. Right? It's pointing us towards that world of activity. Right? And so this is where I started to look at those lineages and linkages, right? So first with Mike Cole, I found that very interesting. His that link. I mean, my own entry point to Vygotsky, like many of us who read this in the West first, was that Mind and Society book from 1978, the collection of Vygotsky's writings. For many years, that was our only Vygotsky, right? And so it was interesting to get some of the background information on that, because Mike Cole was instrumental in the creation and the production of that book, and going there in his early 20s, meeting Laurier, not knowing Russian, recognizing the value of this work. Yeah, just really quite amazing. And then doing the work that he did, and neither him nor David Backhertz are two big principal connections here, come from the Marxist tradition, right? So that's also instructive and important in terms of how these ideas have been translated. And then, of course, and this is something I didn't know about at all when I was looking at Ilyenkov, was Engestrom's work, and the center in Helsinki, and all of the work that was being done there, right? And his really worthwhile reading, his book it's an old one from 1987, but that's where he made that really important move, that with the 3 generations of activity theory. And well, I think there's a 3rd edition now that's more recent, 2015, I believe. But yeah, that's interesting, right? And that's him and his collaborators, and they've managed to create a very influential methodology that's been taken up by researchers all over the world. Yeah, that's very much worthwhile having a look at. Really interesting stuff.
Alex, can you maybe draw to a close so we've got some time for questions?
Oh, okay, sorry.
That's great, thank you.
Absolutely. Let me just see.
I think Kyoko's might be able to say a couple of words too.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? I think maybe I'll just finish off here. I just had a bit more detail on this, but basically, I mean, just to sum up, really, the main point of this chapter is to try to introduce this body of thought to those who are not familiar with this, but who are researchers who are looking for a method that's non-reductionist, right? Who might be drawn to, say, discourse analysis, for example, or deconstruction, or there are many different research methods out there. But to look at activity theory as a viable method that is that I think has something distinctive to offer that others don't, right? And at the same time, that those of us who work on the level of methods, not researchers, but those who are just interested in methods for the sake of method's sake, that who are interested in methodologies, that this is very much worthwhile looking at as something that has a greater coherence than immediately appears, because of how diverse and disparate the current applications are. Okay, thanks. I think I'll just leave it at that. And thanks so much for listening, folks. I'm very curious to hear what others have to say, and happy to answer questions.
Thanks so much, Alex. That was amazing. There's already some controversial points in the chat. Maybe 1 or 2 people from the chat would like to talk about that. But I think you're a co-editor Kyoko Murakami would like to say just a couple of words, I think. But also, if others want to look at the chat, some interesting issues about AI and so on.
Sorry, I
Can
haven't been
you
paying
hear me?
attention to the chat at all.
So whilst Alex can catch up with the interesting exchanges in the chat box, I just want to stay in a much more promotional mode. And on behalf of Miriam, we joined this book project as initially chapter authors. But so the credit to this original idea and inception of the idea of the baby was created by Alex. But in a way, we were midwives. We helped giving birth to this fantastic baby that was due. So we were very privileged and happy to be part of this very challenging project, I must say. And Miriam would agree, and Alex, you would agree that this has been a very challenging project in many senses of the words. But we really enjoyed working with the contributors and being able to trace the history of this activity theory for me, from Engström back to those Ilyenkov and Vygotsky, all that, Leontief. I think it was really, for me, is the most incredible experience. And being able to be part of this group now. A few years ago, I joined the Ilyenkov conference in the UCL. And that's where I met Corina and those wonderful colleagues. Anyway, so just a few dates in the diary, I have to say. We haven't been able to make the book launch in our own university context, but I have made the proposal abstract submitted to the ISCAR held in August 26th to 30th in Rotterdam. And hopefully those authors, including Michael and Engström and all these contributors who are able to come to ISCA will be able to share some of their ideas from the chapters. So it's literally a book launch, basically. The publisher won't be able to represent our book and promote it, but we will be doing this in the form of two-part symposium. And another little promotional activity I will make is through the International Society for Theoretical Psychology, ISTP, held in May 20th to 24th, Belgrade, Serbia, University of Belgrade. So I'll be talking about our chapter, co-authored by Miriam. And so through that conference, I will also promote this book. So those are the dates for your diary. And thank you very much. And Alex, it was really nice to work with you. And thanks to actually Katrina Hasse, who organized this post-phenomenology meeting at the DPU a while ago when I was there in Copenhagen. So any kind of serendipity is really something to trace and to kindle and nurture, because you never know, something like that can turn into this kind of amazing collaboration. So thank you, everyone, and nice to meet you, and good evening.
Thanks, Kyoko. So does anybody want to pick up from the discussion about brains and AI and also the issue that came up quite earlier on, is activity adequate?
Okay, so we'll start with George.
Yeah, I'd like just to make an introductory comment to this whole discussion we're going to have. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Just a few sentences. In around 1980, an American psychologist told me, I was living in the Netherlands then, But an American psychologist told me that if attention had been paid to Vygotsky and Laurier much earlier, let's say around 1965, American psychology would have been much better off. That was the intent of what she told me. And at that time, I myself had been reading a lot of Laurier, and I agreed. So now we're catching up, I hope. That's it.
Great. Thanks, George. If you're able to mute yourself, that'd be great. Okay, so anyone who has a question for Alex, it doesn't have to be anything to do with AI. It could be anything that came up in the talk or from reading the chapter, or perhaps a question about the contributions in the volume.
I had a quick question, Alex. I was just thinking, it arose out of the chat remarks. Ilyenkov specifies activity as human idealized life activity. I think that needs to be, very clear that we're not just talking about any activity. We're talking about the activities that rise from the norms and patterns and which are Ilyenkov calls idealized life. I mean, I'd love you to speak more about the role of the ideal in this process, if you can. Thanks.
Karina, maybe we should just take a few comments and questions
Sure,
instead of.
yeah, no problem.
Would that be better? So that way,
We'll pick up two more before we come back here. Yeah, so in terms of questions that you might have, these might be questions of clarification or quite simple questions, or if you'd like something which is more of a discussion type question, we're very open to that as well. So it'd be great to hear from some of you, since we had lots to say earlier that we've contributed in the chat. So if anyone is willing to unmute to ask a question, that would be great. Just let me know by using the hand up function. So we'll go with Sigurd next, and then if anyone has a question after that would be good. Okay, Sigurd.
Yes, thanks for a very interesting introduction, and for a very interesting book anthology, it seems. From the chapter that we've been reading, what I got and remember is that you, Levant, as you trace the Western approach to activity theory, you find it more instrumentalistic, more practically oriented, as I understood you. While Ilyenkov, as you started with, represents the philosophical potential and of this activity theory. So is that a correct understanding, and could you elaborate a bit on that, these two approaches?
Thank you very much. And do we have another question for Alex at this stage? It would be good to have one more before we come back to the question, to the discussion in the chat, so we can do that after this round of questions. But any other general question for Alex? Again, you can put your name in the chat as well, if that's easier. Well, okay, let's take these two, and then we'll come back to the
Sure. I have to say, I'm very curious. I'm trying to find the AI questions, because that's what I'm interested
Oh,
in.
it's okay. Yeah, I'll recap. Yeah, I'll recap that.
If there are others who are interested in that, I'd love to connect with you outside of this as well. But in terms, thank you for both of these questions. Just in terms of the very last one, that I found really interesting as well. The huge difference between Ilyenkov's focus on philosophy, on the big questions, compared to these practical applications. David Backhurst has written quite a bit on this, right? Showing some of those differences. And I mean, there's different ways to read this, right? And there are multiple reasons for this. I mean, first of all, I found it fascinating what happened here. And it just seemed like this weird mirror world when I first came across activity theory, but particularly in terms of very practically oriented applications. I had a hard time reconciling that with what I was looking at in terms of Ilyenkov's philosophy. It just seemed like something completely different to me. And then when I started to realize the path that got there, then I realized what happened, right? Or at least to some extent what happened. I found that interesting. But what I also discovered is that it's not all like that. And as you see, some of the pieces in this volume, some of them are practically oriented, but are also politically oriented. So, for example, Brecht de Smet's, his piece on the uprising in Cairo, in Egypt, the Arab Spring in 2011. He did a lot of work on this. He wrote a book on this as well, where he brings activity theory and Antonio Gramsci together to do an analysis of how this social movement created a situation where its participants rapidly acquired skills and learned. Right. And so it's a very practical application, but something like that is much more recognizable, it would be, I think, for Ilyenkov, because it's rooted in the Marxist tradition. It's oriented on the same kind of project, or maybe not the same. I mean, we're dealing with different historical context, of course, but it's rooted on it's within the Marxist tradition, rooted on that kind of a project, as opposed to trying to make an organization run more smoothly, for example. Right. Completely different thing. Right. And so I found that as well. Right. And that's happening too. So where does that fit? Right. So I found that kind of interesting, that you have these practical applications that are still politically motivated and politically oriented. Right. And I really feel like I'm just scratching the surface here. Right? As many of you probably know, those of you who are working in this field, there's so much more going on here than that. Right. So yeah, so I think that line of division, I guess, it was there. I noticed that. But the more I looked into it, the more I began to realize that it's a bit more complicated than that. And that it's worthwhile looking at this thing as a whole, rather than as just, you know, completely separate things. And just very quickly, in terms of Karina's question, in terms of or point, I guess. Yeah, the activities we're talking about with Ilyenkov are socially meaningful activities. Yeah, not just any kind of individual actions, but practices like pointing, for example. You know, prior to that experience of pointing, that same gesture wouldn't have been socially meaningful yet. All right, so we're talking about particularly those kind of practices that are socially meaningful. Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Maybe there.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if Andre still has the question. If so, you know, I'll come back to it in a minute. So to recap the AI point, so Jaakko made the point that, well, AI isn't, you were saying that AI systems right now are not intelligent, but AI learns by us interacting with it. So is it not in that way taking on the kind of sociality? Is it not that way involved in activity? So that was that point. And then Nicholas pointed out, okay, but it's dealing in frozen images. So it's still frozen images of our activity. It's not actually our activity as such. And then Jaakko suggesting, well, at the moment with our current LLMs, that's the case, but perhaps in future, it'll break through and deal with other things. And Jaakko made this suggestion that with AI, that image of the frozen sailor, well, you can play back the film, and then suddenly its ideality is revealed. So there's all kinds of discussion points within that, which I think which are quite rich, I think, for us to unpack. So yeah, any initial responses, and then I wonder if anyone else in the audience has a comment on that.
Wow, I would love to do a whole. We should do a session on focused on that if there's interest. That would be so interesting.
Yeah.
Can I make a quick response?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, sure. I mean, this is something I've been looking at as well, how these systems learn compared to how we learn as humans. There are substantial differences, and I think a lot of the problems is that we're using the same language, even like learning, intelligence. All of these words that we use we understand on some level they're not the same for these machines, but they trick us. Right, and they trick us into feeling that they're doing something that they're not actually doing. So when these machines learn, yeah, they do learn through interact. Like what type of learning happens through interacting with humans, but that is not at all even similar to what happens when a human interacts with another human. It's just a completely different process. I guess there is that similarity that there is an interaction. But that's where it ends. All right. And I mean maybe that's a topic for another time. But ultimately here, I guess on a philosophical level, staying with Ilyenkov, the reason I think he would be quite convinced if he were here that this is not a technological problem. Like this is not something that can be resolved by better technology, in the sense that at some point there can be a technological breakthrough that will be able to achieve this. That's not a technological issue. It's a social issue, right? You would have to create something that would mimic the experience of a human. And I guess that might be possible, but you can do that already by creating a human, right? It's much easier, right? So I guess but that's not really the main point here. What I think Ilyenkov points us to is just a really different way of understanding minds, a perspective from which it becomes incomprehensible that a machine would develop a mind. Right? Yeah, I don't know. I think it's so hard for us to break out of. We all live in popular culture, right? And we're just filled with these images of these sentient machines from all our popular culture. But from this perspective, it's hard to imagine that happening. Like, at most, we'll get our like really smart machines that we can talk to, but they will never have they would never have a mind in the sense that we would, regardless of the technology.
Thanks. Yeah. Does anyone else have a comment on this particular discussion?
Can I just small comment?
Yeah.
You know, I am this kind of person who has like 1,000 of non-written articles, and one of this unwritten article was about, can we talk about dogs' minds, and the dogs as a kind of a which as a animals who are sharing with us some schemes of thinking and so on, and then like this kind of discussion of AI is a little bit misleading, because this usual tricks we have with computers and so on in mind. But I think some kind of intuition could be built from this kind of a simple interaction. Like, I don't know how the dogs are able to internalize some social schemes and react and so on, and then think like from this simple example to build this discussion a little bit what is thinking, especially when you think about this kind of a thing we're thinking with a body, like if you experience this agility things or whatever, like for sure you have to start to think about thinking with the body, not yours, but the dog's body and so on. Yes. And then, it was my intuition, but of course I never developed this. I have a paper in the conference, slideshow, and nothing more. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
And Lydia, and then back to Sigurd.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm a very new member of this SIG, so it's lovely to meet you all. I've had some quite frightening interactions with AI recently, and I think I'd been thinking of that as completely separate to the way I've used activity theory in my own academic work. I'm in education at the University of Newcastle in the UK. Would it be possible to ask for some suggestions for some introductory readings on AI and activity theory? Is that something to follow up at the conference maybe, or would it be possible to just ask for some recommendations, please?
Thanks. And Sigurd? You're muted. Yeah,
Okay.
no.
Well, concerning the AI, actually, when you hear the discussion about AI you find that there actually is no theory about consciousness. That's the problem of all these discussions. We are very infatuated and very interested in and talk about AI, but that's a big problem, that no one can really tell what is consciousness and how can you talk about artificial intelligence if you don't really now have a concept about what is. I think, and that's about positivism, because and as a researcher of this Soviet tradition of which Ilyenkov belongs, there actually are very interesting works being done by Soviet scholars on explaining the fallacy of positivism. Very, very good, nice studies. There's a guy called Shviryov. He made the best analysis. This is works that are rather unknown in the Western context. But these were, of course, very known to Ilyenkov. So I understand why this is extremely interesting, because we are all we have all discovered Ilyenkov. We find him extremely attractive and revealing. And then you have this discussion on AI, and of course this activity approach is sort of a missing link, because it's an approach to consciousness. What is consciousness actually? And there is not a competing theory about consciousness actually. It's only this positivist fallacy and a big question mark. But this activity approach is empirically founded, and it can explain some things about consciousness. And then you get what you say, Alex, that it's only a fantasy that these machines should get intelligent. So that's in this perspective, I think.
Okay, and I guess as the third thing, a quick question from me. In the past, I was surprised to see you argue that there are productive exchanges to be made between Ilyenkov and various people within the kind of movement of post-humanism that tries to decenter the human to focus on the relations of fire and cotton, of the way in which a dump of rotting food interacts as itself without human interaction. In this latest chapter, it seems like you've sort of re-emphasized that we should in some ways preserve the human. So why would we want to preserve the human against people like Latour and Bradotti? So yeah, if we can come back to that, and then Corinne, if we can go to yours after Alex has responded to these.
Thanks for those questions. Let me start with the last one. I really appreciated that one. That's something I thought about for some time as well. Maybe it's a nice way to get away from the AI stuff for a little bit. So, which is what I'm tempted to talk about, because it's just on my mind presently as well. But in terms of post-humanism, yeah, a few years ago, I found myself interested in this what is it, new materialism, and the so-called what was it called, the material turn. And I found Ilyenkov's work useful as a critique of that, as an alternative material approach, right? Because I mean, as a graduate student in the 90s, I was largely steeped in perspectives that went in the other direction. Looked at the social construction of meaning and critiques of positivism and those kind of things. And then all of a sudden, it seems like there's a critique of, I guess, an unsatisfaction with that, a dissatisfaction with that, that it's, everything seems to be about language, and what about, everything seems to be taking it into account except for the material world. It's kind of been lost, So then there's been this turn to materialism again, except this materialism, this new materialism, and this turn to post-humanism in a variety of ways, whether we're talking about, Bruno Latour and STS, or Rosie Braidotti, who I think is much more interesting, or Karen Barad, who I looked at as well, who's also very interesting, a post-Deleuzian theorist. There is this turn to matter in a very 19th century way, like what Marx would see as a pre-Marxist materialism, and so I was trying to think of it that way. And so, bringing Ilyenkov in as a counterpoint to that, as an alternative materialism, right? And so that's how I was thinking of it. Not so much in terms of affinities with them, but really as a critique, I guess, or as a way of critiquing it. I wrote something. I can send it to you, Kirill. By the way, Kirill, I'm really happy to meet you. I've seen some of your clips. Not sure where I came across. Maybe it was through this or something, but it was through you that I came across Tomasello, Michael Tomasello's work. I read or saw something that you were speaking about, and then I read his book, Being Human. That made a big impact on me. Yeah, but I wrote something called Smart Matter and the Thinking. But that's what it was: Smart Matter and the Thinking Body, where I compared Ilyenkov's concept of the thinking body to this concept of smart matter. Everything is so smart these days, right? And it dovetails very nicely to artificial intelligence. It's all of a sudden, everything became smart, and now it's becoming intelligent. So we've been primed for a long time now to expect machines to be intelligent. We expect that. Anyways, I think it'd be very interesting to do some kind of a symposium, and maybe like a special issue of a journal on activity theory and AI. Coming back to Lydia's question, I haven't come across anything. I don't know anyone who's written on AI from an activity theory perspective. Maybe there's something out there. I just don't know. But I find myself having a perspective on AI through activity theory that is quite distinct from others. It does give a different perspective on things. It's distinct in the sense that it demystifies it. I don't feel afraid that it's going to come and attack me and eat me and have new agendas. But at the same time, I don't feel like it's how can I put it? Like, I feel grounded. I feel like it grounds me in my understanding of it. I'm not as dismissive of it either. It doesn't make me feel like it's just a fad or something like that. Like, I feel like it allows me to grasp it both as limited, but also not as a fad at all. Like, I think this is a very significant innovation that is not going to create robots that'll do things that we expect, but it's going to have a huge impact on us, right? And so I think it's I think activity theory helps me see this in a sober way. At least that's how I experience it. So I think it would be great to have other folks who are working in this field to focus on those things, and I'd be very happy to collaborate. I haven't written anything on this either, and I would like to. And I'd like to have collaborators to think through this stuff as well.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we'll just come to Karina next.
Yeah, I just want to say that David Backes wrote a book about the space of the mind. Asking the question, what space is mind in? Now, I think that's relevant to this discussion, because consciousness and mind are not the same thing. They're obviously connected. But when we're talking about Ilyenkov's theory of the ideal, what is that in relation to mind and consciousness? And I mean, Alex has called this a special objectivity, and I think that's a very important combination of words. Has a special objectivity, and the question was asked a minute ago: what is this materiality of this? What does it mean to say it's a materiality? Has a materiality? It's obviously not something we can touch as we do other objects, as Alex has pointed out right at the beginning. But it's it does occupy a space, an ideal space. I don't know if we can get away from the word ideal here. Ideality is a property of human social and objective existence. So perhaps the concept of social consciousness, as Marx defined it, in association, but also in contradiction with social being, that they are not the same thing. Consciousness and being are not identical, but it's this dialectical relationship between them that perhaps helps us understand what ideality is as a special reality. But that's, you know, in other words, it's not so. Ilyenkov's theory of the ideal is not social constructivism, because he doesn't reduce it to subjectivity, whether social or individual. It's not reducible to subjectivity, because the world of the ideal can persist, as in books or plays, but it can only become alive through the activity of humans. It can only continue through that as a special reality. And that's my bit.
Yeah, before we close, Lars, I'm not sure if that already is the sort of question that you were going to ask. If you still have your question to ask, then do it. If not, then that's fine.
Could just add to thank you very much, those of you who've put your emails to the chat, so that we can let you know about further events. And there's various calls for papers from the and there's a conference in Berlin in April about Ilyenkov. So there's a lot going on this year, which we can try and share with you. But I want to really thank. Sorry.
Oh, we do. Sorry, we do have a final comment or question from.
Sorry.
Juan.
Okay.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Oh. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, thank you. I'd like to say that what I'm going to talk about isn't that closely related with AI or consciousness, and I'm here this time to report the current situation of Ilyenkov translation in China, and maybe I can seek for some suggestions from you, maybe. Okay, so as we know, China is quite special about its cultural context. As we know, it has inherited a Stalinistic dogmatic reading of Marx in its philosophy. So maybe I'd like to know that after a Marxization, there are two tendencies in Chinese philosophy research. One is a Stalinistic reading of Marx and Lenin and other writers. And also there is another one, a more Western, a more chic one, that researches those, as we know, those radical theorists like Zizek or some I don't like them. Whatever. I think that rejuvenating Ilyenkov may make some difference because we can see that in Ilyenkov's philosophy there are the evaluation of Spinoza's emphasis on substantia and causes theory. So maybe that can answer many timely questions. Yeah. So and also about the current results of Ilyenkov research in China. Only 2 major works have been translated into Chinese. One is the Dialectics, the concrete and the abstract in Marx's Capital. The other is Dialectics, the ideal. And in the past 4 decades, there's only 8 papers directly about Ilyenkov published in China. But there is a good tendency in China that Ilyenkov research is highly associated with Mega-2 research and the reading of Marx's manuscripts. So we Chinese focus more on his understanding for philosophy, especially dialectics and political economy. So we may maybe we are focusing less on the psychological side of Ilyenkov, as you've been mentioning. And is this good? Maybe yes and no. So we won't distort him into a non-philosopher. On the other hand, we lack some accompanying thinkers' research like Kedrov and Gopnin, which has been ignored for many centuries, many decades. And so I like to ask, maybe, are there suggestions about this vacant field of Soviet research that you guys recommend? And that's it. That's great.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Very final thing, quick comments from Yanis, and then if Alex has any comments in response to any of that, then great, and then we'll close after that. So Yanis.
Yes, thanks, Kirill. Thank you very much, Alex, for your talk. It was very stimulating, and it's very important what you have stressed concerning the use of the concept of the idea and to connect it with the current discussion on the AI and so forth. I would like to have a comment. I don't have a question. I just want to have a comment concerning the relation materialism, ideal, and so on, and the importance of the concept of the ideal in the contemporary discussion, also from the aspect of the Marxist research that we have doing in this field. I think the work of Ilyenkov on the concept of the ideal is an open research project. It's not a definitive research that Ilyenkov has done, but it's an open research project, because I believe that at the time of Marx, the crucial question was to answer about the logical priority between idea, consciousness, thought, and being, social conditions, and so on. But in nowadays, we can revisit this discussion and to conceive the ideal as the state of the matter that it develops under specific conditions of matter of the living beings, and in this context to connect the concept of the ideal with purposiveness, because I believe we can understand the development and the emergence of the ideal through the animals. For example, the different forms of interacting with nature of the living beings, we can see the ideal as emerging from this process, and to understand the ideal in the human beings as the form that is interrelated with purposiveness and with the function of description, explanation, and anticipation. What I want to say is that it is a matter of a huge discussion, and I totally agree with what you have stressed at the beginning of your talk, that starting from the ideal, we can elaborate further research project within the Marxist discussion that can help us revisit crucial epistemological issues from this exactly from this dialectical perspective of the ideal and of the concept of purposiveness. So that's what I want to stress as a comment. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your talk.
Thanks. So if there are any responses to any of that, Alex, all's yours, and then we'll close straight after.
Yeah, thanks folks for all the comments, and I hope I can I haven't been able to keep up with the chat, but I hope when this is over I can just read through it afterwards, because it's hard to I find it hard to listen and to read at the same time. Just very quickly, in terms of the AI stuff, I hope we can just maybe, I just want to bracket that off, and maybe at some point I would love to do something separate on just on that topic. And if anyone is interested in that, in activity theory in relation to AI, just please send me an email. We can correspond, and I'd be happy to share that what I haven't written anything about it, but I've been thinking about it quite a bit, and I've been doing some reading, and so I'll be happy to share what I've come up with, and maybe we can work together. Coming back to AI aside, to the central issues. I think maybe just one thing to wrap up on, I just want to, maybe as a way of tying things together, is clearly Ilyenkov was what brought me to activity theory, but what brought me to Ilyenkov was Marx. I was working on the problem of consciousness in Marx before I met Ilyenkov, right? And so I was trying to. What Ilyenkov helped me with something that I think is quite useful, and I think is there within the activity theory tradition, but we don't really see it immediately because it's being applied in all sorts of all sorts of ways that are important given our realities. But I think it could have other applications. What I mean is, my graduate studies were on Marx and Western Marxism and the problem of consciousness in Marx, namely the role of consciousness in the revolutionary process. Marx's intervention in 19th century socialism, focusing on practice, focusing on activity, the role of self-activity, the role of working class self-activity as the agent of change, as opposed to like a from above kind of socialism being brought in from the outside, so to speak, right? Consciousness being the necessary ingredient. So the cultivation of that kind of revolutionary consciousness becoming a project, right? How to understand that. This is what I was thinking about at the time when I met Ilyenkov, right? And I found I was largely focused on critiques of, Second International approaches through the work of people like Lukács and Gramsci and other the Western Marxist tradition. When I came across Ilyenkov, I found a fresh voice in all of that, because he seemed to look at things at the level of ideas in a broader way, and to connect it in terms of activities to how society was structured much more broadly. In a way, I can see the connection between what he was doing with what Lukács and others were doing much earlier, in the sense that looking at the role of the party as cultivating skills, basically cultivating practical skills, but also a practical attitude, a practical understanding of the world. Right? so that's really where my work was going, right? It's trying to understand those kind of questions. That's what drew me to Ilyenkov. And so when I came across activity theory, that seemed like such a departure. Why would you want to apply those ideas to something as mundane as making a business more efficient or something like that, right? Nevertheless, coming back now, looking at things more holistically, it only, I think, it only confirms, I think, my initial view of the efficacy of these ideas. And I guess what I'm hoping is for this to be taken up, A, on a philosophical, theoretical level, right? And B, on a political level as well, right? And that's something I'm seeing a little bit of already, right? But not that much. And I think there's so much work to be done there, right? That's really where I see so much potential in this project. So I hope that makes sense. If folks are interested, have a look at this book. I'm sure the others are happy to share their chapters with you if you just send them an email. I can also send you the interviews I did with David Backhurst and Michael Cole. Just let me know. I'm sure they wouldn't mind. Yeah, and I'm happy to correspond as well if anyone wants to send an email about this. Okay, I'll end here. We're wrapping up. Sorry, Carol. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, Alex. It's been fascinating.
Thank you for inviting me.
Discussion.
Let's make it less than 10 years.
Yeah, Karina. Next November, I'll try to make it to London next November for sure. Great. Thanks again, everyone.